All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester and Director of the Forest Connect program, which includes this monthly webinar series. I'm appreciative that you all are here. And we have, earlier I checked, we had a little over 200 people registered for today. So that's a very nice turnout and interest in silvopasture and soil carbon. And we are joined by Dr. Joe Orefice. Did I get that right, Joe? Close. Okay, good. Um, who's done a study on what happens when you add trees to pasture and the changes that he's found in those soils and soil carbon. So I'm going to turn off my video and turn it over to Joe. If you have questions, type them into the chat window as we're going along, and Joe will answer all of those at the end of this. So, Joe, thank you. I appreciate it, and welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me, Peter. And it's really encouraging to see almost 100 people on this call. So that's really wonderful. I'm glad to chat Silvopasture with all of you. I'm going to load my presentation here. And if anybody can't see that, give a loud shout in the chat or so. Um, and I'll get rolling here. If you have questions as we go along, I'm not going to field them as we go along because if I try to monitor the chat and go through this presentation, I'm going to get lost. Um, but feel free to queue up questions in the chat, and at the end of this, we'll have plenty of time to go through them. I'm expecting to talk for maybe about 40 minutes, and then leave a good chunk of time there at the end for questions. So I encourage you to put them in the chat. If I may not respond to them right away until the end. So yeah, thanks everybody. I am I wear a couple of hats in my role. Um, I'm a lecturer at the Yale School of the Environment. I teach courses in agroforestry, forest management, forest operations, maple sugar production. I'm director of forest and agricultural operations at Yale Forests, where I oversee the university's 10,000 plus acres of educational forest land, which is actively managed land as well, um, and educational and outreach opportunities through that. And then I've always worn another hat in my professional realm as a farmer. And this image here is from a farm I used to own and operate in northern New York in the town of Saranac, where I was practicing silvopasture. And when I took a job at Yale in 2018, I moved the livestock and a greenhouse and truckloads and truckloads of farm equipment down to a property here in Connecticut, Union, Connecticut, where I raise grass-fed beef in using silvopastures as a tool, um, and grow vegetables and things of that nature. So I kind of bring some science and some practice. Relative to silvopasture, my first tie to silvopasture was as a forestry student, and I got more involved with it as a so at University of Maine, I learned a little bit about it as an undergrad forester and got a little bit more involved with it through my PhD when I had been practicing it on my farm in New York and trying to learn more about it. And so I did a PhD through the University of New Hampshire, studying silvopasture systems in the northeastern United States. Um, Here at Yale, I advise some Master of Forest Science students, and this is one of those projects that we took on with one of my former advisees, William Weinberg, who did a Master of Forest Science at Yale. And so let me get into the study. Um, and I'll talk somewhat generally about carbon dynamics of silvopasture systems, but I'm going to really talk quite a bit about what we found in this research. If I can figure out how to advance, there it goes. Um, so when we think about forest carbon, silvopasture carbon, however you want to think about it, there's a number of ways we can think about it. We can think about carbon storage in the actual ecosystem, the land, so in the silvopasture, in the forest, how much carbon is actually there. We can think about carbon stored in forest products, so products that leave the forest but then may stay stored in something like a building, like in the image you see on the left. And we can also think about carbon sequestration, which is carbon that's actually pulled out of the atmosphere and then stored in a product or in an ecosystem or soil and all the rest. And so silvopasture, we tend to think about it in terms of carbon storage and carbon sequestration as a way of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it somewhere in the ecosystem or in forest products. What I'm going to talk about today is carbon storage. So the project that we did over the last few years here was just a snapshot of storage. We didn't look at annual intake, outtake of carbon. We simply looked at what is there in the ecosystem at this point in time when we sampled these farms. So why care about silvopasture carbon? Well, it's one of these nature-based solutions and to climate change. It's this idea that we can use natural systems as a pump to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it somewhere in terrestrial, or some nature-based systems are related to the ocean and wetlands and the rest. But silvopasture certainly is terrestrial. And this World Resources Institute paper that came out a while back lists a number of different ways the climate potential of these nature-based solutions. And I like this. It's a nice visual. It gives you an idea of where we fall with agroforestry and agricultural soils. And so you see the two of them that I have circled there: enhancing carbon in agricultural soils and improving forest management and agroforestry. So both of these are potentially where silvopasture falls in, meaning, can we increase the carbon content of agricultural soils by adding trees and grazing livestock? The other question is, can we improve agroforestry, the practice of silvopasture, or the implementation of silvopasture, and store carbon, such as in the trees? And so silvopasture gets a lot of attention as a nature-based solution. This is another paper that's out there. Um, I don't think they define agroforestry well in here, but they define it as a nature-based solution. Um, It's more, they define agroforestry as the practice of planting trees on farmland, including as rows between crops or as shelter for livestock. It's a lot more intensive than that. It's a lot more intentional than just planting trees on farmland. And that's a whole other topic to describe what agroforestry is, or silvopasture for that matter. But the point is, silvopasture gets a lot of attention um, as a nature-based solution, as a potential for carbon storage, carbon sequestration. And there really isn't a ton of work on it in terms of actually quantifying that. How does that compare to some of these other agricultural systems? Ironically, that paper is about getting the message right about nature-based solutions, and I think there's some improvements on agroforestry and ecology. The agroecology is the study of agricultural ecosystems, not necessarily a practice as an ecology. So we can apply these to silvopasture, and this study is a little micro. The study I'm going to talk about today is a little microclimate of that. One other example of where agroforestry falls, this is back to that World Resources Institute paper. And you can see right in the middle of this, agroforestry has high potential for global greenhouse gas mitigation. Um, it has great climate adaptation benefits by creating more resilient systems, agricultural ecosystems. It's got medium biodiversity conservation benefits, and this is really one of those things where it depends on what kind of agroforestry, even silvopasture, right? Are you losing grassland bird habitat by adding trees to a pasture, or are you gaining early successional habitat but losing late successional forest habitat? There's all these questions, right? Everything's good or bad for wildlife. Depends on what wildlife you're talking about. Um, but then agroforestry has a lot of high benefits for food security as well. So there's all these co-benefits to agroforestry as a nature-based solution, and specifically silvopasture often stands out as one of the top practices from a nature-based solutions. So for those who aren't in the carbon world every day, there's some key concepts to think about when we talk about carbon storage and sequestration. Permanence is one of them. So in this context, permanence is the extent that the activities are reversible. So yeah, you planted a bunch of trees, but then those trees just die. How likely is that going to be for sequestering carbon, right? Is you establish a silvopasture, is it going to stay a silvopasture, or is it just going to be there for a blip in time? If it's a blip in time, that's not that permanent. Trees tend to be more permanent than some other ways we manage the environment. assuming we get them established and growing. Leakage is another concept, so it's the potential for changes in land management in one area to result in offsetting changes in another area. So, for example, if we get decreased forest production in silvopasture, leading to greater needs for hay, like on any given farm, um, that may mean there is a greater amount of area that's non-forested or non-silvopasture that's producing that hay because of the reduction in forage due to silvopasture. And I'm not trying to imply that silvopasture always reduces forage. It doesn't. I have some other work we could chat about if you want at the end, if people want to talk about this concept of forage production under trees. But that's an example, and it could do that. So, and then additionality is the carbon benefit that would have not happened anyway. So it's the intent. It's the what did we do actively different here to sequester more carbon than if we were to just do nothing? And for example, planting trees into a pasture is very clear additionality. There was not a long-term carbon storage plant, aka tree, there prior to us planting it and getting it to grow. And had we not planted it, it would not be there because we manage the system and prevent trees from growing. So, like in something like a treeless pasture. So one of the neat things about silvopasture, and what I'm going to talk about today, silvopasture by addition, it has fairly clear additionality because we are putting trees into um, formerly treeless pastures. So these benefits, these potential benefits, and I already saw earlier in the chat somebody posted a paragraph about the potential benefits of silvopasture from a climate change perspective and carbon perspective. Um, the dynamics around silvopasture are variable with carbon. One of the first questions you got to ask is what is it being compared to? Because people talk about it as a great practice, but what are you comparing it to? Are you comparing it to a closed canopy forest? Is that closed canopy forest healthy? Is that closed canopy forest resilient to climate change? Um, are you comparing it to treeless pasture? Are you comparing it to degraded woodland pasture where somebody's fenced off the woods and just put animals in there? Those all have very different benefits of silvopasture depending on what you're comparing to, or a cornfield for that matter. A cornfield has incredibly different carbon dynamics than a silvopasture. So, what are you comparing it to, and what farming systems I think is really important to just think about as you think through this process. Um, in the study I'm going to talk about today, we compared it to treeless pasture. How are forest products utilized? Longevity wood products, alternative to fossil fuels such as firewood. Are they producing these things? That's a really important question because the longevity or the replacement value of the carbon coming out of those forest products can be a really important factor in the benefit of silvopasture. The type of silvopasture really matters. I give you an image here of cattle in a fruit orchard silvopasture at my farm here in Union, and that's a wonderful system for a lot of reasons that I think is a really top silvopasture for a lot of reasons, or on its way to being one. That's a young system, but um, it's not the best for carbon in terms of comparing it to the type of silvopastures I could be establishing. I mean, something with long-lived, large canopy trees that store a lot more carbon would be a better carbon storage than peach trees and apple trees and pear trees. But what are you comparing it to? It really matters in what type of silvopasture. So bigger, older trees tend to have more carbon. And then the grazing strategy can matter as well. There is some work out there on different grazing strategies and their impact on silvopasture. So, something like a timber plantation here from our friend Brett Chedzoy over at Angus Glen Farms. This has a lot more carbon storage. At least we can visually see that above ground because they become a lot larger than something like a fruit tree. Even within an orchard system, right? A silvopasture pecan orchard like this image here from Georgia, versus an apple silvopasture in northern New York that you see on the right. So pecans on the left, apples on the right. That pecan orchard has a lot. You can see the greater amount of carbon in there just from the size of the tree. So everything's not always just silvopasture does this or silvopasture does that. And one of the reasons I'm laying this out for you is the results I'm going to show you today are going to be variable in terms of how much carbon benefit there is in silvopasture. And I don't want somebody to, and I apologize up front if you were here today to get the exact benefit value of carbon stored in silvopasture by addition. I'm not going to give that to you because it's so variable. Um, but the idea that I want you to leave with, so my conclusion at the beginning here, is that the trees are clear additionality compared to a treeless pasture or compared to a cornfield, some treeless area. They're fairly easy to quantify, and they're clearly carbon stored in a spatial area that we can see and was not there prior to trees being planted or established. Um, and then I don't think I need to say it on the call, but I can. But within these silvopasture systems, you still have forages in there that are being grazed, so it's got that dynamic too. But I mentioned earlier about grazing practices can have an impact on carbon. So there is research out there that rotational grazing can increase soil carbon compared to continuous grazing. And that's what this figure from this publication, Moser et al., shows is that it's the AMP bars on the left. That's rotational grazing, as we would say. And then the CG is continuous grazing. And they looked at carbon stocks, total carbon stocks of those systems. And you can see the rotational grazing had a greater total carbon at different, and you can the shading there are different depths. So A horizon, below the A horizon. Here's another one. The soil carbon benefits of silvopasture. It depends on what you're comparing it to. So this is comparing a number of different um, ways we might convert one system into another system. That's what this sequestration analysis did by DiStefano and Jacobson. So they were looking at, well, what if you took a forest and turned it to a silvopasture? Well, you can see if you took a forest and turned it to a silvopasture, they're predicting a pretty significant negative change in the carbon stocks. The soil carbon benefit. That's being predicted there. Pasture to grassland to silvopasture, they're predicting an increase in the soil carbon. So this is just looking at soil carbon. But that's some of the work that's been out there. And this is an analysis that was looking at a number of other studies. So meta-analysis. So they had 5 studies that they found where on average there was a 40% reduction in the soil carbon when taking a forest and converting it to a silvopasture. And there was I don't know, looks like about a 5% increase in soil carbon when you took a pasture or grassland and planted trees to silvopasture. But this is all very nuanced, and this is a global meta-analysis, and so you're looking at forests for the first part. You're looking at forests that were on a variety of different soils. Some of them were likely on tropical soils, which are tropical forest soils, which are inherently low in carbon. And therefore, if you cut a lot of the trees, you might lose a lot more of that carbon as well. So there's some nuance to this, but there's also nuance to silvopasture and what direction you're taking it. So this leads me to the recent work that I want to present today. This was in conjunction with the National Agroforestry Center, and we wanted to actually quantify the silvopasture carbon. What is the dynamic? Because people talk about this a lot, but there's not a lot of science actually quantifying the values of carbon, the stores of carbon in these ecosystems. So we wanted to assess that and compare the carbon content of silvopasture versus treeless pasture. And the region we focused on was the northeastern United States. The rationale for this, there's just not that much information out there. And there's incentives, there's promotion, there's talk about, hey, silvopasture is this great nature-based solution. But if we don't have data to actually back that claim up, we could be making promises that are overpromised or underpromised. So our research team here, William Weinberg completed his Master of Forest Science at Yale University, 2022. He's in this image here, digging soil pits. He did the bulk of the work for this project, and Will gets all the credit for doing all that hard work to make this project happen. Um, Dane McKittrick is a Master of Forest Science student who collaborated a bit towards the end of this project because he took on the second stage of this, which I'm not going to present today, which is looking at the carbon dynamics of silvopasture by subtraction. So what happens when you take a forest and you cut a lot of the trees, establish forages, and make silvopasture? What does that do to the carbon? So that's for a future date. Although I could chat in the at the end a little bit about that if people want to. I'm on there as the PI of this project, principal investigator, and then from the National Agroforestry Center we had Matt Smith, who's the research program lead there, a really key player in not only funding this project but helping to get it through the finish line. And then Mark Batchelar, who worked with us on the analysis, he's also from National Agroforestry Center, and he was really key in making sure that our analysis was sound as part of this project. So, part one, that's what I'm talking about today. This is silvopasture by addition. So these are silvopastures where trees were established into formerly treeless pasture. Part two is where we look at areas where trees were removed from a forest to develop silvopasture. So we're looking at silvopasture by addition. Methods that we utilized, well, we purposefully selected farms where they had established silvopastures by getting trees into treeless pasture. And they had adjacent treeless fields on the similar soil type, with similar pasture management that we could compare. So we wanted to make sure there was that level of afforestation to develop the silvopasture and then an adjacent comparison. And on most of these farms, that was all within the same field where a portion of the area was planted and a portion of it was continued as treeless. So you can see we had 3 farms in New York, 1 in Vermont, or sorry, 4 in New York and 1 in Vermont. And most of them were grazing cattle, although some were grazing, one was grazing goats. And we weren't comparing grazing management. We were comparing the system as a whole. You can see years since tree establishment. And that was one of the priorities. We wanted to make sure that these weren't new sites. We didn't want to go to areas like that fruit orchard that I showed you earlier, which was planted, 6 or 7 years old in that photo. That's not a lot of time to see soil changes. So we wanted to go to ones that had been established for a while so we could see the picture towards the end. So again, this is a snapshot. I'm not pretending to present every carbon dynamic when you plant trees into a treeless pasture. It's a snapshot of a few purposefully selected farms so we could see the comparison there. To quantify the ecosystem carbon, we actually wanted to get as many measurements as we could. So we measured tree biomass, forage biomass, again at a point in time, and soil carbon through carbon soil sampling. And then we paired those with the treeless pasture measurements. So we measured the carbon in those systems as well. Obviously, we didn't measure trees in the treeless areas because they were treeless. Here's an example of one of these sites in New York where you have the treeless pasture adjacent to, and these two were adjacent to each other, but the photo is just a split of them. And then the silvopasture that's 33 years old at the time of the study. So you can see just how different these are, although they started at the same playing field 33 years ago. And the reason we did the study this way is we didn't want to wait 33 years or 50 years to like plant trees and watch how long they grew, because Will wanted to complete his master's degree in a couple of years. And the National Agroforestry Center certainly had deadlines on funding. So we went to places that were already established and took a picture. Took a measurements picture as well. So tree biomass, we documented that through systematic sampling of all trees in fixed area plots. So we set up fixed area plots in these silvopastures, took a number of tree measurements, and used allometric equations to convert those tree measurements to above ground and below ground carbon stocks. We used primarily diameter for that because the equations at the time were based mostly on diameter. In 2024, some new equations have come out that use total tree height, which is helpful. But if you want to get deep into those methods, I can chat about them later. And you can also see the citation for our paper here our published paper and scientific reports that you can dive into those methods and critique them if you'd like. Um, Forage biomass. So we clipped the forage in fixed area plots during the growing season, and the roots are also collected. So when we clipped forages, we clipped them below 10 centimeters in height. So we cut them at 10 centimeters. We did retain that material, but what we actually analyzed was the forage above ground that was between 0 centimeters in height and 10 centimeters in height. And the reason we went with that range is 10 centimeters is a typical minimum grazing height. So you don't typically graze below 10 centimeters. And that made it uniform between treeless pasture and silvopasture, not only between farms, but within any given farm. Because since we took a photo, we didn't have the ability to monitor that forage growth through the entire season, including periods of grazing and periods of regrowth. So this allowed us to go and take a picture and say, look, we're just looking at this. It also makes our forage values a little bit more conservative in terms of their total carbon. But forage is one of the smallest carbon pools in these ecosystems. So that's how we did it. And we used allometric equations to take those dried forage volumes and convert them to carbon. Soil carbon, we used a fixed depth sampling scheme. So soil were collected at a number of different gradients, so 0 to 10 centimeters, 10 to 30, 30 to 60, and 60 to 100, or until a ledge or a hard pan was reached. So any of you from the northeastern United States are familiar with rocks, and you're familiar with probably glacial hardpan. And those both stop the majority of rooting, especially when it's solid ledge. And unfortunately for us, those are not all at the same depth across all of these sites. So we had silvopastures that had soil depths going to 30 centimeters, and then in some plots it went to 60, and some plots it went to a full meter. And the same thing with the treeless pasture. And so what we did was we went to the tallest minimum depth, the highest minimum depth. So if one plot went to 30 centimeters and two of them went to 60 and two others um, went to 1 meter, we just stopped them all at 30. So we were more conservative in our soil carbon numbers. Um, Then if we did the opposite, where we assumed that all the soil depth went to 1 meter, then we would be overestimating our soil carbon. So we tried to underestimate the carbon when we could here. And we were consistent as well between silvopasture and treeless pasture. So we weren't um, having major errors in comparison just by using different soil carbon depths. This was one of the real challenges of the project because we couldn't get, just with the scope of it, we weren't able to get like ground sonar to map the whole soil depth across the entire pasture and silvopasture. So we tried to be conservative and consistent when making comparisons. And then we used statistical analyses to compare within farms and not between farms. So we weren't trying to say silvopasture is greater on one farm than another farm because of any given reasons. We were trying to show the difference between silvopasture on farm A and treeless pasture on farm A. And then we were trying to compare silvopasture on farm B and then farm B. So our replication here within a farm is rather pseudo-replicated. We have one silvopasture, we have one treeless pasture. But we did this on multiple farms, which gives us that replication to say, hey, these results have some valuable information because we can look at what's happened in different places. In some ways, that's really valuable because it's not just saying, hey, on this one farm in this one town of New York State. So here's some of that sampling that Will conducted. You can see on the left, he's actually on the left. What he's doing is he's sorting out forage roots out of the topsoil to just collect all those forage roots and separate them from tree roots. And then on the right, he is actually clipping forages within our fixed area plot at one of the subplots in this silvopasture in New York. So one of the metrics we measured, and getting into the results here, we looked at soil bulk density. Bulk density was really critical for us using fixed area soil sampling to figure out the actual carbon content. So we didn't want to know the percent carbon. We wanted to know how much physical carbon was in the soil. We needed bulk density to figure that out because that's a measure of how dense the soil is. And bulk density tells you something else about the health of the soil and the levels of compaction. And what we found here was on 3 of the 5 farms, soil bulk density was significantly greater in treeless pasture than in silvopasture. And the trend across all farms was that there was greater bulk density in treeless pasture versus silvopasture, which is an interesting result in itself because it's consistent with past research um, that silvopasture tends to reduce the bulk density of the soil. The roots of the trees are either themselves through penetrating the soil and decomposing, right, in that process, reducing the bulk density, and or the tree roots are actually holding up livestock. So the impact of livestock grazing isn't compacting the soil to the same degree that it would where you just have treeless pasture. So that's kind of an interesting result in itself and in the value of silvopasture on soil health. This was one of the main figures and take-home points from our study, and I'll dive into all these different ecosystem components in a little bit more depth. But this is comparing the carbon stocks within farms to adjacent treeless pasture. And you can see each farm here is a comparison between treeless and silvopasture, and you can see the different soil carbon pools. So this darker tan pool is the soil, and the soil is a major pool of carbon. Don't stress too much about the difference in soil carbon between these farms. Like, why does Farm D have such a small amount of soil carbon compared to Farm A? That's probably mostly related to soil depth. So Farm D is likely on a soil that's a lot shallower than Farm A. But the soil carbon's playing a big role, and you can see the forage roots there are a good size component, and they're definitely the roots of the forage are a greater carbon pool than the forage itself. Keeping in mind though that the roots we quantified all of the roots, and the forage itself we only measured it from 0 to 10 centimeters. So there's a little bit greater of a pool in the forage above ground. And the zero line here um, is the ground level. So you're looking at above ground, below ground. It's not that soil has negative carbon. It's just below ground levels, why it's presented this way. But what really sticks out is additionality, right? Is silvopasture has all those green bars on top. And those green bars are the above ground carbon of those trees. So those are the true additionality of putting trees into the system. And you can see a little bit more of that when you look below ground and you see the light green, which is the roots of the trees. That's one of the keys in this is you can see the proportion of carbon in the trees compared to the tree to the below ground carbon. And remember, these were areas that have been planted, and most of them weren't quite 50 years old. Most of them were less than 50 years old. So the trees in these systems weren't fully mature. And that's pretty significant because there's still room to sequester and store more carbon within those trees. As they get bigger and yeah, maybe it gets a little more dense in the canopy, but it still would probably function as a silvopasture. So it depends on how much thinning might occur or anything like that. Um, but the tree pool really stands out in this. And what doesn't stand out is the forage pool and the forage roots. Those are not major drivers. And so I've heard people talk about, oh, if you cut the forest and you get rid of the trees and you plant grasses are going to have these incredibly deep roots and they're going to make up for the loss of tree carbon. I don't see that happening. Not in these systems where we have cool season grasses. Anybody's ever dug a hole in their pasture. You notice your forage roots, they don't go all that deep here in the Northeast. Because we're primarily dealing with cool season grasses, which have shallower root systems. If you are in an area with really deep prairie grasses that maybe go a meter or two deep in their roots, that's a whole different dynamic than what we see in um, uh, temperate, humid climates where we have cool season grasses. So key findings from the tree perspective. Tree carbon, as I mentioned, was a major contributor to the difference in the total soil carbon between silvopasture and treeless pasture. The clear additionality there by having the trees. And I think that's nice because you could say, well, I want to quantify the benefits of these systems. In my opinion, quantify the value of carbon in the trees if you want to like incentivize somebody through payments or something like that to put in a silvopasture. Don't worry about the soil carbon, just use the trees as the clear additionality. Um, Keep in mind, tree stocking was variable between farms, species, density of those trees, age of those trees, size of those trees. All that plays a big role in how much carbon was in those. Um, yeah, so the growth rate of those trees can play a role in the long-term additionality as well. So key forage findings. The forage carbon trended lower in the silvopasture than the treeless pasture. So we tended to see less forage carbon in the silvopastures than we did in treeless. It was only significant on 2 of the 5 farms, but there was a trend across them all. I think this is really important because a lot of that forage carbon was in the roots. And so the second point here, the carbon in the roots was generally lower in silvopasture than treeless pastures on 4 of the 5 farms. I think this is really important. I mentioned that the forages aren't making up for the potential loss of tree carbon if you were to compare to like a closed canopy forest. But the other really important thing about this is the forage carbon, the forage biomass of the roots. So like the biomass of forage roots in a silvopasture was less. That means those forages may be a little bit more sensitive, maybe a little bit less resilient than you see in a treeless system. And so it doesn't necessarily mean you're always going to get less production because that's going to be related to moisture and moisture stress and moisture availability, which those variables can be very different in a silvopasture than a treeless pasture. And we can talk about drought and forage production in the question and answer session if people want to get into that. But the management of silvopastures, I think, is important to this point because we might want to be a little bit more careful in how we graze, a little bit more intentional in how we let our systems recover when we're grazing silvopastures than in a treeless pasture, because our forages may not have quite the same amount of biomass to recover from grazing or to recover, more importantly, from damage that we might do from poor grazing. So it's not a knock on silvopasture. It's just saying, hey, let's maybe be a little bit more thoughtful in terms of how we handle our forages in those systems. Just like if we have a tree on a site with quite a bit of drought, we might want to be more active in how we water that tree, right? We care for it a little bit more because it's a little bit more stressed of an environment for it, or an environment where it doesn't have quite as many resources. Key findings from the soil. So soil carbon dominated the carbon pool. It's a huge pool. And there's a lot of carbon there, and it's super important. Highly variable. Both not only the depth of the soil, just like the physical amount of it, how physically deep it goes is variable. But it's just variable across the sites. And we didn't find a difference between silvopasture and treeless pasture. It doesn't mean there isn't one. It just means we weren't able to show one. We weren't able to prove one. What that says to me is that the difference isn't extreme between silvopasture and treeless pasture on these post-glaciation soils of northeastern United States. So I don't want to make that general claim for all soils, but I would say if the difference were extreme, we probably would have been able to tease it out. But there likely is some difference. We're not teasing it out in this study. And then I mentioned the bulk density, which is an important point in terms of just soil health as well in the silvopastures. So key ecosystem findings here. Overall, ecosystem carbon in silvopastures was greater than treeless pastures. Don't take these numbers as like what somebody should bank on for how much carbon they're going to have by planting trees into a silvopasture after 30 years. because these are averages from 5 very different farms on different soils with different trees. But that difference, that relative amount of difference, that 43% increase in carbon stored is a good, comfortable to me rule of thumb to be like, hey, this is the additionality that's coming out of primarily trees being added to treeless pastures, is a 43% increase in that ecosystem level carbon. Um, that's a little bit elevated because, again, remember our soil depth. Um, we didn't quantify soil depth down to the deepest soils. We quantified soil depth down to the shallowest restrictive layer. Carbon stocks, again, greatly varied from farm to farm. And forage carbon was only a really small part of that. Uh, Carbon stock values for the silvopasture study were slightly lower than northern hardwood forests. So, like, how does this compare to forest, right? So we pulled a couple of studies that looked at total ecosystem carbon or ecosystem level carbon of closed canopy forests in the northeastern United States. Catanzaro and D'Amato, they reported ecosystem carbon values of 190 megagrams per hectare for 80 to 100-year-old northern hardwood forests. And our silvopastures were on average 136 megagrams per hectare. So less than that closed canopy forest, but treeless pasture was less than half of that. And then Hoover et al., they found about 216 megagrams of carbon per hectare for old growth northern hardwood forests. So if you want to compare, silvopasture to forest in the region, these are just some ballpark figures that give you an idea of the scope compared to what we measured. Keeping in mind that our soil carbon was conservative here because we stopped at the nearest restrictive layer within our plots per farm. So point being, silvopasture may, and even treeless may be a little bit more comparable to the amount in these close canopy forests. So some challenges of this work, if anybody's in this realm or thinking about following up or working on similar research, again, snapshot in time, or just wants to be critical, I'll be critical with you. It was a snapshot in time on each farm. One blowdown changes the whole dynamic here. Determining percent soil carbon is not enough when trying to figure out actually the benefit of these systems because you have to look at bulk density. How dense is that percentage in there? And we also use soil equivalent mass, which is a better way to look at soil carbon. It's just not as commonly used. So we analyzed it both ways using soil equivalent mass and fixed depth sampling with bulk density. We didn't find any difference between those two for our study, so we felt comfortable presenting it the way we had originally designed the sampling. But I did want to point that out. And in the publication supplemental materials, we provide our soil results using soil equivalent mass additionally for people who want to use that. The depth of the soil is variable within nearly every pasture system. So one of the biggest challenges to me, and actually, if you wanted to know, like if you were like, I want to know the exact amount of carbon in my pasture, in my silvopasture, in the soil, you have to, if you really wanted to know exact, you would have to figure out how all those undulations average out for a soil depth across your system. It's pretty challenging. Um, and then we used allometric equations, right? So we didn't cut down all the trees and then burn off their carbon and then reweigh them and figure out how much carbon was there. We didn't cut them all down and sink them in water and look at displacement by volume and then try to figure out how much carbon. What we did was we took physical measurements on standing trees and we used existing, accepted, published allometric equations to go from diameter to total carbon in that tree. That those aren't perfect. There's a lot of variability tree by tree in there. Our tree carbon values may actually be lower, or it may be lower than the actual carbon content of those trees because trees in agroforestry systems are more open grown and therefore likely have more carbon per tree diameter class than you would find in like a straight, tall forest grown tree that these allometric equations were based on. but we don't have allometric equations for trees grown specifically in agroforestry systems. And we have to use what was available. So, part two of the study, which I can talk a little bit about if people are interested, but this was looking at silvopasture by subtraction on ecosystem carbon, and we should have those results published in 2026. But that's the idea of removing trees from a closed canopy forest and establishing forages. So here's my contact information. Happy to chat with anybody. If you shoot me an email and I don't get back to you, feel free to send it over again because I get drowned in emails now and then. But I'll try to respond to you. And yeah, the citation for our publication is down at the bottom in Scientific Reports, and it's open source, so I encourage you to check that out if you wanted to read through it. And from there, I will happily take some questions.
Joe, that was great. I really enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun. So this is a chance when you all are able to type in questions. There have been a few that have come in, so that's good. And while you're thinking of those questions, I'll just point out if you're interested in continuing education credits, you've done what you need to do. And I pull down the webinar data and then I sort it. If it cooperates, I sort it based on the request for continuing ed credits. And then I send out documentation to all those people that says, here's proof that you participated. And I forward that to the Society of American Foresters. So if you're looking for the CF credits, you don't need to do anything else. And if you have other continuing ed interests, then you need to take care of those. So Joe, I think you've probably answered. So the first question I had was on and I know you were doing snapshot in time, and so I was wanting you to speculate, but you did that pretty much with Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro's work, and it looks like the changes between so those were ecosystem changes. The differences between your study, which had forests that were in the 25 to 45 year range roughly compared to a 100-year-old, that increment is, I mean, there's a lot of wood volume that accumulates between the age classes that you are working with in a 100-year. I'm assuming that most of that change then in carbon is associated with above ground trees, not with changes in soil. Would you guess the same?
Yeah, I think the soil carbon is, and especially with part two, I know some of the preliminary results there. We're not seeing major differences in soil carbon when you actually cut down a forest or most of a forest and make a silvopasture. We're not seeing major differences in the soil carbon there. So I think those soil carbon pools are really, I don't want to say stationary, but heavy to move, if that
Right,
makes sense. Or just so big that these changes we make on the surface aren't as major impacts on the broad soil carbon pool, especially when we go to these deep levels. On again, young glacial, relatively young, right? 10,000, 14,000 year old. That's young for soil,
right.
young glacial soils. So yeah, I think that tree carbon is really a big part of it. And the bigger we get the trees and the older we get the trees, the more carbon we can store. The one dynamic there is these systems that I presented here, as they grow up, some of those trees are going to be removed to give the residual trees more room to grow. Peter, I don't need to explain this to you, but um, you know, that's going to shift the carbon balance too, just because there's less trees, but the trees that are residual are bigger, and so they're going to have carbon.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so Joe, if you want to scan back through the questions, or I can, um, they're time stamped. So if we need to,
Yep. I'm looking at one from 1227. Agroforestry is the broad science of integrating trees and crops, livestock. Um, and silvopasture is one specific practice, making it unique. Any thoughts? I'm not sure um, I can answer that because I got lots of thoughts on silvopasture, but I think I gave a bunch of those. So if that person wants to ask that a little more specifically, I think I could answer that. Um, and I think I already answered some of that in the presentation. So there's one here about deer and elk seem to be able to eat any kind of tree leaves and stem tips. They certainly do. Um, and there are tree leaves and stem tips that are toxic to beef and dairy cattle. Um, Definitely there's some toxic plants out there like black cherry, things in the prunus genus. When they wilt, they can have some toxicity. There's some discussion I've read about red maple having toxic potential for livestock, especially when it's wilted, probably not cattle as much. Um, so yeah, there's some of that. I mean, I deal with a plant, an invasive shrub up here, Japanese barberry, which is certainly toxic to cattle. The way I deal with this, and I know some other farmers deal with this, is having animals that are raised on their mothers and they learn to avoid it, and then also not starving those animals so they don't feel the need to go to toxic plants. When I was younger, I grew up, my parents raised sheep, and it was like you'd bottle feed a sheep and then you'd go put it out and it would die because it didn't have a mother to learn from, and it would go eat the most toxic thing right away. And so I think beef animals and dairy cattle are pretty robust to toxic plants and pretty good at avoiding them. But there are things that are, I mean, pokeweed is one that comes to mind that could give you some worry. Um, in fact, I had a little bit of a panic attack this fall, and I got a fancy new dairy cow to add to our lifestyle and started eating pokeweed. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this animal is not going to survive in a pasture system. But she did all right and didn't get sick from it and didn't eat too much of it. And I think that's just the nature of beef animals and dairy animals being big. Um, but certainly if you were starving an animal and that's all they had was pokeweed or something, you'd be pretty concerned. So I can't say for all the, North America, all the toxic plants. I'd say there are some out there, but making sure your pastures have good feed in it. So if you have a lot of good quality feed, healthy, non-toxic feed, that's going to help you prevent the smaller risk of toxic plants. That'd be my best answer to that one. And I wouldn't say silvopasture is any more or less than that. All depends on your management. Um, and then I see some folks put some resources in there, which is great. Um, Understory soils would seem to receive precipitation at a different intensity than open pasture. This may also affect bulk density over time. Yeah, perhaps silvopasture soils might get precipitation at different intensity. Um, I do think if you have good forage cover, that's going to buffer some of the intensity of that rain. But yeah, the 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 mechanism by which bulk density is less in silvopasture than treeless pasture would be a really neat study to dive into. Um, Question here about thoughts on rotational grazing in silvopasture systems. Um, I think rotational grazing is really important in silvopasture systems if the comparison we're talking about is continuous grazing. Trees especially don't want livestock on them all the time. Um, there's some real benefits to rotational grazing in terms of being able to manage your forage as well. So the quality of your forage and what your animals are eating, and then giving it time to recover and regrow. In my opinion, if you're just doing continuous grazing in a treed area, I would say generally that's not silvopasture because that eventually is gonna degrade your forage to a point where you don't have the three components, trees, forage, and livestock, that make up silvopasture. So I think rotational grazing is pretty important. Exactly how long the rotations are and how big the paddocks are and all of that, I think really depends on the farm management system and the forage growth and also the precipitation and the soil type and the density of trees. So there's quite a bit of variables there. But I think you have to get animals away from those trees at periods of time, um, and allow those forages to grow. Uh, Red maple leaf comment, that's good. Looks like the database that Cornell has lists alfalfa as poisonous. Maybe it depends on what stage it's at or something. Or too much, I guess supposedly too much of any legume can cause bloat and things, so maybe that's why. A bunch of thanks, so I appreciate those. Looking at the 1247 mark. Is there value in growing fast-growing, short-lived trees like aspens and willows or long-lived hardwoods? It's a good question. If you're thinking about planting trees, what's your primary goal? Is it to get shade right away? If you want shade right away, those short-lived aspen and willows are going to grow fast and they're going to give you that shade. Um, they may have some tree fodder benefits if you're thinking about grazing aspen leaves, for example. But they're not going to have a lot of value in the long term in terms of like a forest product. So yeah, they're going to provide shade, but they're not going to be very valuable timber wise. Um, and so that's just one of the questions you need to ask yourself is what are you looking for there? And then carbon wise, aspen and willows are a lot less dense in terms of their carbon than something like an oak tree might have. But an oak tree is going to take a little bit longer to store carbon. So an oak tree may store carbon a little slower than an aspen tree, but in the end will store more carbon per mature tree size, um, and for a longer period of time. So tree selection, it really does depend on what you want. I tend to lean towards stuff that the tree is going to have value. So the tree is going to have more than just shade value. So um, either fruit for me or livestock or timber or something like that. So I tend to lean towards higher value stuff. But that's a personal choice. And maybe because I'm a forester as well. Uh, More about spillovers, indirect land use change. If forage carbon was less in the silvopastures, does that mean there will be less forage for grazing as well? No, so that's a really good question. So we did show that forage carbon was less in the silvopasture, the biomass, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's less for grazing. It depends on when it is. So in that early spring period, when you have just a whole bunch of forage growth, or early summer, when you have a whole bunch of forage growth after green up, you're probably going to have less in your silvopasture because the shade from the trees is going to reduce that forage production. And there's some of my past work showed this, and certainly a lot of farmer experience in the region has showed this. But then in the middle of the summer, when you have drought, you might get more forage production, or definitely you will have higher forage quality in your silvopasture than you will in your treeless pasture. And that's a pretty common thing too. So, like when I think about managing a silvopasture, I think about, yes, during green up and early summer, I'm going to have less forage produced in my silvopasture, but the quality of that forage come like July will be a better quality than in my treeless pasture. And I can graze it then, and I'll get a regrowth during late July and August of that silvopasture forage when I may not get a great regrowth of my treeless pasture, which is going to be far more dependent on rainfall. Um, and then I think in the fall it's kind of similar in terms of like treeless pasture and silvopasture seem to have similar production in the fall. That's my experience. I think there's a lot more work on this that could be done, but I think that's the value of it. Um, any info on forage quality from carbon content? I think I just mentioned that. I'm not going to tie into the methane. We didn't study the methane production of cattle from it, and I don't have enough information to get into the methane differences on that. Um, in New York, lots of dairy farms grazing many years and long-term foraging. How would you transform this area for agroforestry? Possible soil conditions? Would the soil need replenishment? So I think if you have pastures that are been grazed for a long time, and you want to put some trees into them, I don't think you need to amend the soil too much. Usually, areas that have been farmed for a long period of time have better soil than forests, and trees are going to grow really well. I think the key is protecting those trees from livestock grazing. Um, I think the key is making sure that your soil isn't too compacted, because maybe you ran out of forage or not. I'm going to assume you have really good grazing practices there, so I think you're good to go with that. You just got to figure out a way to get those trees established, keep the livestock and the deer off of them, and the voles, the meadow voles. Um, are pin cherry and wild sweet cherry leaves as bad as black cherry leaves in terms of toxicity? I don't know about that one. I would try to avoid all of them if they were wilted. I've seen livestock eat all of them, including sweet cherry leaves. They were not supposed to eat cattle. but those were fresh off the plant, which is a different dynamic than wilted, and it's also a very different dynamic than like a baby lamb going to eat somebody's pin cherry, which could be a lot more toxic based on that. Um, Goats seem to will with polk and barberry. I've not seen any luck with goats and barberry, but if somebody's got a goat that'll do that, that'd be pretty nice. But haven't seen that. I don't know about pokeweed with goats. Eli posted the 6-week online Silvopasture training course. Thanks, Eli. That's a really solid course from Cornell Small Farms. Yeah, I'd give that one a thumbs up if folks want to get into it more. Um, Question from an agronomist. Do the allometric equations used include tree root biomass and associated carbon? So the equation we used are estimating tree root biomass from the above ground carbon. So the equations take the diameter measurements and then they estimate the above ground carbon of those trees. And then you use another equation to go from above ground carbon to below ground carbon of the tree. And so that those are the ones we used. And those are in the publication, which is open source. So you can see the equations we used and the sources, which were from the U.S. Forest Service. Eli asks, is there an easy way for landowners to keep track of above ground carbon estimates? I think the easy way to keep track of your above ground carbon estimates is to keep good measurements on your trees. So you can measure your trees, you can measure the diameters, and with the new equations, use diameter and I think it's total tree height, if I remember off the top of my head. So with diameter at breast height and total tree height, you can figure out the total carbon. And so that's a good way to do it if that's what you want to do. And any forester worth their salt should be able to do that. Um, is there a plan for regeneration or just replant? Yeah, so that's a good question. Replanting is a really common way to do it. You can certainly exclude livestock for a period of time to get tree regeneration to come back into an established silvopasture. Um, yeah, there's a number of ways. I mean, I know with black locust, some people use a coppice system for it. So it depends on the trees and what stage you're at and what your problems are. But if you want to continually graze the silvopasture and regenerate, then you need to think about tree protection, which could be linear planting or linear fencing to keep livestock off certain rows of trees, or it could be cages around individual trees. It kind of depends on your livestock and your deer pressure and all the rest. Forages for shady environments. We didn't, in this study, uh, test different forages for that. The one I say that seems to work well for a lot of northeastern silvopastures is orchard grass. It just stands out on both acidic soils, which is a big player in it, and shaded areas. But uh, tall fescue is another one that a lot of people have used in silvopasture with some luck. And so, yeah, I think the legumes, clovers seem to work well, red clover, white clover, but you got to make sure your pH is up there. So I think I've satisfied the questions. But I appreciate everybody joining and listening in today.
Great job, Joe. I think you got all the questions as well. I appreciate all the questions that came in. Those were fun questions, very insightful and spanned a spectrum of things to talk about. So, well, Joe's going to be back at 7 o'clock tonight if you want to see this presentation again. Um, and if not, we'll see you in January. So look forward to having you back. Joe, thank you again. Very
Yeah,
well
thank
done.
you, Peter. Thanks for the invite. And
So
thanks,
we'll
everybody.
get you on the 2026 schedule.
Well, you'll get my graduate student, I hope.
All right.
You
Okay.
can
All
speak.
right.
It'll be good for him. Cool. All right.
Very good. Take care,
Thanks. See you.
everybody.
See you later this
Yep.
evening.
Yes. Thank you.